New York City in the 1920s, an era marked by the roar of jazz, the allure of speakeasies, the daring fashion of flapper dresses, and, of course, prohibition. Underneath the gleaming lights of Times Square and the carefree atmosphere of the jazz age, there was a simmering tension. The city, teeming with millions of people from every walk of life, could erupt over the unlikeliest of reasons. And in 1922, it did just that. Only it wasn't about politics, money, or even prohibition. It was about hats. Yes, you heard that right, hats. This is the bizarre tale of the Straw Hat Riot of 1922, when a seemingly trivial fashion faux pas snowballed into street violence, chaos, and an eventual police crackdown. Let's unravel this odd chapter of New York City history, one brim at a time. To understand how a riot over hats began, we need to step back into the fashion world of the early 20th century. The 1920s was a decade of transformation. Cars replaced horse-drawn carriages, silent films were slowly giving way to talkies, and jazz music enthralled the younger generation. Fashion, too, experienced a shift, reflecting the optimism and modernity of the age. For men of the time, headwear was an absolute necessity. Everyone, from bankers on Wall Street to dock workers unloading ships, wore hats. It was part of a man's wardrobe, not just an accessory. In the summer months, straw hats were indispensable. Lightweight and breathable, they were the perfect solution to the city's sweltering summer heat. Not only did they provide relief from the sun, but they also offered a stylish finishing touch to a man's outfit. Straw hats came in various shapes and names. The classic boater with a flat top and a ribbon around the crown. The Panama, a slightly softer hat woven from palm leaves, and other regionally popular variations. Regardless of the specific style, these hats were embraced by nearly every class of society. Whether you were a successful lawyer marching down Fifth Avenue or a factory worker in the Lower East Side, if it was hot, you'd likely be wearing straw on your head. But the 1920s wasn't just about comfort. Social etiquette and fashion rules were taken very seriously back then, often to the point of absurdity. And one of these unwritten rules revolved around when one could or couldn't wear straw hats. It was generally accepted that you could wear a straw hat during the summer, but once the cooler weather rolled in, it was time to put the straw hat away and switch to a felt or wool hat. The unofficial cutoff date for straw hats was September 15th. Before that date, it was normal, expected, even to be seen in straw. After that date, it was seen as a breach of decorum. Imagine it like today's no white after Labor Day rule, but with far more serious social consequences. Men prided themselves on being sartorially correct, and violating this straw hat deadline was considered a mild disgrace, something that opened one up to both teasing and, increasingly, unwelcome attention. For some, this transition from straw to felt was simply a part of the calendar, like the leaves changing color in Central Park. You wore your straw hat up until mid-September, and then you swapped it out for something more seasonal. For others, this rule presented a playful opportunity to punish the outliers who dared ignore it. Pranks emerged around this practice, particularly among teenage boys who found it amusing to knock straw hats off the heads of those still wearing them after the cutoff. What started as good-natured ribbing, however, would soon escalate into something the press would call an outright riot. Our story's turning point came a bit earlier than usual. The date was September 13th, 2 days before the unofficial straw hat deadline. A group of teenagers, feeling brazen, decided they wouldn't wait until the 15th. They descended on dock workers near Mulberry Bend. These workers were just finishing their shifts, likely tired and unsuspecting. The teens snatched straw hats off the men's heads and gleefully stomped on them in the street. Perhaps it was meant as just another year of mischief, but this time they picked the wrong crowd. The dock workers didn't take kindly to the prank. Tensions flared, and before long, fists started flying. Within minutes, what began as a handful of teenagers versus a few dock workers spiraled into a full-blown street brawl. Witnesses heard shouts and curses as men fought back with the raw strength earned from years of physical labor on the docks. The teenagers, outnumbered and threatened, scattered. But the sparks of what was to come had been lit. A small incident, yes, but in the days that followed, gossip spread rapidly through the city's neighborhoods, particularly among other groups of teenagers. Some accounts made the teens out to be underdogs who nearly got beaten by older, stronger workers. Others portrayed the dock workers as villains who had taken a lighthearted prank too seriously. Either way, the incident stoked a collective sense of indignation and fueled the desire for revenge, especially among New York's youth. As word traveled across boroughs, a sort of anti-straw hat fervor spread. More teenagers began organizing, each wanting to be part of enforcing the unspoken rule: no straw hats after mid-September. It was almost like an odd form of vigilante fashion police. By the next day, large groups, some called them gangs, though they were often just packs of rowdy boys, roamed the streets, looking for anyone who dared defy their seasonal edict. For many, it started as an excuse to skip school, roam freely, and cause mischief, but the situation quickly spiraled out of control. Armed with sticks, some even hammered nails into the ends, these teens patrolled the thoroughfares. If they saw a straw hat perched atop someone's head, they'd close in like wolves on a stray lamb. To them, it was exhilarating, rebellious, and in their view, justifiable punishment for committing an unforgivable fashion sin. September 15th finally arrived, the traditional day when straw hat season officially ended. Instead of the mischief dying down, the city erupted. By now, the story was on everyone's lips. Straw hat smashers had overtaken entire blocks, and the chaos was only growing. Times Square, already a bustling hub of theaters, hotels, and restaurants, became ground zero for this bizarre phenomenon. Mobs roamed about freely, prowling for potential victims, tourists, businessmen, even well-dressed socialites stepping out for dinner shows. If they wore straw hats, they were fair game. It didn't matter if it was a brand new boater or a treasured Panama from a high-end haberdashery. Once spotted, it was as good as gone. Journalists Journalists stationed near Times Square reported scenes of utter mayhem. People on the sidewalk shrieked in alarm as hat smashers descended upon them. In some areas, traffic came to a near standstill because crowds had spilled onto the streets to watch or join in. Some onlookers treated it like entertainment, laughing at the spectacle. Others tried to shield themselves from the roving gangs with newspapers or briefcases held awkwardly overhead. Strangely enough, some of the city's more daring inhabitants, undeterred by the threat of a beating, walked around with straw hats after the cutoff date just to flaunt their boldness. Perhaps they saw themselves as rebels challenging the tyranny of teenage fashion enforcers. Their brazenness, of course, only escalated tensions. The mobs weren't satisfied with just pulling off hats. They began humiliating their victims. They'd toss the hats onto the pavement and stomp on them triumphantly, egging each other on. Some accounts claim they'd form a little circle, placing dozens of confiscated hats in a heap, then set them ablaze or shred them to pieces. The cheering from these raucous gatherings could be heard blocks away, a macabre carnival of hat destruction. Many victims tried to flee. Some desperately clutched their hats, only to be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Others fought back, unwilling to lose what might have been an expensive purchase. These altercations triggered additional scuffles and small riots within the riot itself. Estimates suggest that on September 15th alone, thousands of hats were destroyed, and the number of smashed hats would continue to climb in the ensuing days. No social status offered immunity. Business magnates, office workers, and even policemen were targeted. One unfortunate police officer was famously caught off guard during his patrol. A gang of teens approached him, yanked his straw hat away, and smashed it. When he tried to retaliate, they dissipated into the crowd, leaving him hatless and fuming in the middle of the street. The fact that even law enforcement couldn't escape this mania speaks volumes about the brazenness of these mobs. As news coverage of this strange phenomenon reached the front pages of local papers, the city's mood shifted. What had begun as a series of pranks had devolved into genuine street violence. People were getting hurt, some quite seriously. Even the act of ripping a hat from a person's head could lead to physical struggle, and rumors circulated that teenagers were brandishing weapons, from batons to lead pipes. Shops with window displays of straw hats reported vandalism, mannequins were toppled, and merchandise was stolen or destroyed. With the city gripped by near hysteria, some men tried to prepare. Hat shops did a brisk trade in felt hats, and some owners capitalized on the frenzy, posting signs that read, "Avoid the smashers, buy your felt hat today." Others went so far as to offer hat protection deals, special discounts if you traded in your straw hat for a felt model. Yet for many individuals, especially those who couldn't afford a new hat or simply liked the comfort of straw, switching hats was not an option. They either stayed indoors for fear of being attacked or ventured out bravely, risking the wrath of the roving mobs. Crowds of over 1,000 people were reported in certain neighborhoods. These throngs would gather at intersections, forcing passing cars to swerve around them. Trolley lines were disrupted. Curious bystanders, wanting to witness the mayhem, only added to the congestion. The city's infrastructure was ill prepared for this type of spontaneous, widespread unrest. The violence escalated from hat snatching to outright brawling. Teenagers and grown men clashed on street corners. Some older men fought back with canes or even improvised weapons like broken chair legs or broom handles. Reports of injuries began to mount, from bruises and black eyes to more severe harm that required hospital visits. In some instances, the hat-smashing mobs didn't just attack hats, they assaulted the men wearing them. Law-abiding citizens found themselves living in a city turned upside down. That a piece of headwear could spark such aggression was astounding, yet it was happening in broad daylight. The spree had no single ringleader, which made it difficult to quell. Instead, it was a chain reaction of countless small groups, each deciding it was their duty to enforce the unwritten seasonal dress code. Under the unrelenting tension, some neighborhoods essentially policed themselves. Local men formed impromptu watch squads to protect family members from hat-smashing gangs. A father might stand guard at an apartment stoop, warning off any teenagers who ventured too close. In other parts of the city, however, these protective efforts added to the chaos when they confronted the mobs directly. It was vigilante justice clashing against vigilante fashion enforcement, a recipe for brawls all over Manhattan. When strangers passed each other on the street, mutual suspicion arose. Was the other person friend or foe? Would they forcibly remove your straw hat, or come to your aid if you were attacked? The lines between perpetrators and victims blurred, sowing confusion across the city. Police officers themselves faced unique challenges. Some, out of practicality or preference, were still wearing straw hats. After all, the weather was still warm in mid-September. Seeing uniformed policemen with straw hats gave the mobs extra motivation, almost a trophy to collect. Enraged officers chased after the culprits, resulting in more scuffles, more arrests, and further sensational newspaper headlines. In the days that followed, dozens of hat smashers appeared before judges in cramped courtrooms across the city. Many were minors who received stern warnings and lectures about respecting public order. The judges often showed some leniency. This was, after all, a crime of mischief taken too far, rather than grand larceny, or worse. However, a handful of habitual offenders, especially those who attacked officers or caused significant property damage, weren't so lucky and faced heavier consequences. Despite these swift legal actions, the mania still burned in pockets of the city. It would take time for the fervor to die down, especially since much of it was propelled by peer pressure, pent-up energy, and the sensationalist coverage in local newspapers. Nonetheless, the police crackdown marked the beginning of the end. With patrols more visible and the threat of arrests looming large, many of the teenage gangs saw the writing on the wall. They moved on to new pursuits, just as spontaneously as they had started terrorizing straw hat wearers. By late September, the chaos subsided, leaving behind a city shaken by the sheer absurdity of the events. Hundreds of hats were were destroyed, dozens of people were injured, and countless more endured public humiliation. Businesses capitalized on the frenzy. Hat shops promoted felt hats as the safe alternative, while newspapers ran biting editorials mocking the lunacy of the riot. The riots left their mark on the city, prompting authorities to take even minor public disturbances more seriously. It was a turning point for New York, proving that even the most trivial traditions could ignite chaos in the right conditions. The Straw Hat Riot became a cautionary tale about mob mentality, capturing the absurdity and volatility of the Roaring Twenties. Today, the Straw Hat Riot is remembered as a peculiar chapter in New York City's history, a bizarre moment when social etiquette and rebellion collided. It serves as a reminder of how societal norms, no matter how trivial, can wield surprising power. Fashion rules like the September 15th hat deadline have faded, but the riot remains a testament to the quirky and unpredictable spirit of the 1920s. For a brief moment, a simple piece of straw headwear symbolized defiance, tradition, and chaos, all rolled into one. The Straw Hat Riot of 1922 is a story of its time, equal parts ridiculous and revealing. It highlights how fashion, peer pressure, and youthful energy can spark unexpected turmoil. As strange as it may seem now, the riot reminds us of the power of collective behavior and the ways even the smallest provocations can grow into citywide events. Next time you see someone in a straw hat, remember this quirky episode from history, a tale of hats, rebellion, and the ever-vibrant streets of New York City.